Thank you very much and welcome everyone for the DPU Dialogues in Development. My name is Chaim Yacobi and I'm from the DPU. And today I'm very happy and very proud, I would say, to introduce a colleague that I really admire her work, Ola Oduku. Ola took up a chair in architecture at the Manchester School of Architecture a few years ago. And prior to this, she was a reader in architecture and Dean International for Africa at Edinburgh University. Ola's research focuses on modern architecture in West Africa, the history of educational architecture in Africa, and the contemporary issues related to social infrastructure provision for minority communities in cities in the West and South. Currently, she's working on a project dealing with architecture of aid. The webinar is similar to our other events. It will be a 1-hour event. We will have Ola's presentation. Then my very dear colleague, Kama Patel, will comment on Ola's presentation, and we will open the possibility to raise some questions and comments. Please, if you have any questions, use the Q&A section, and we will look at it and we will ask Ola to refer to it. I think we could start, Ola. So the floor is yours. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm just about to share the screen, which hopefully will work. Right, so I'll ask the question, can everybody see the screen? I hope so. That's a yes. Okay. So thank you to Chaim and the DPU for inviting me to do this, what I call a lockdown lunchtime seminar. I would say also that I'm speaking very much in my own professional capacity, although obviously I am employed by the Manchester School of Architecture. But this is very much, as I see, a discussion paper. So everything's up on the table for discussion. For those of you who were able to see the abstract, what I've done really is to, I guess, reflect, as one is entitled to do, I guess, in this period of time, on how teaching architecture, particularly in the West and particularly in the United Kingdom, I would say has changed over time. And I think some of the questions that are being, or rather we should be asking a series of questions as to where this is going, because I think things have changed a lot. So what I've got is, I think, well, hopefully less than 40 minutes of talk, and there are some diagrams, bear with me, that's my thinking, and there's some pictures, but really I'm seeing it as a discussion which sets an agenda to discuss. So going from the first, hopefully, I'm going to see whether this works, it should do. Right. So I'm going to give you a brief historical context as to where I think particularly architectural education, but education related to architecture and planning has come from. And then we'll talk about what it's like now. And then I guess the impetus of the talk is very much to say, well, what might the future be? Diagram in the back is a hotel in Kumasi, not Kumasi, sorry, in near the dam, Akosombo Dam, and it shows this interesting, I would say, mixture of architecture where you've got effectively semi-Islamic architecture in what's supposed to be Safari Lodge style near a dam, which again shows, I would say, the interesting intersectionality and combinations of culture that we deal with today. So just to give a quick anecdote, I started teaching way back in the 90s. And in those days, I remember my first full appointment, which was at Liverpool University. I did manage to get a set of students to go down with me to visit what was then the newly independent South Africa. It was considered an exotic trip. It was considered very well off the beaten track. We weren't going to America, we weren't going to the West, and we had to really sort out insurance. Nowadays, the students I teach, most of them at least have one or two people who are from outside of what we'd call Britain, often outside of what would be called the West. and most of them have traveled extensively. And I guess my premise at the end is very much that this is going to change yet more, because I think directions might become multi-directional in terms of how travel happens, who's doing the traveling, and where the traveling is going to. But just to give a short kind of quick historical analysis, I would say architecture, particularly in the United Kingdom, has a kind of pre-1945 pedigree, where it was very much actually still linked to apprenticeships and teaching. It really got incorporated into the body of academe from the 1940s to the 60s, and then the 60s to the 80s, I would say, was probably the high point of architecture and the internationalization of architecture. I think with the expansion of the West, it became more than just, I would say, British Western, but particularly with the taking down of the wall, so the relinking of the East and the West, and also I would say Asia's emergence from the 80s onwards. We have a very different view of where the architecture is being taught, who the students are, and indeed what the options are. And I would say from the 2000s onwards, post-MT generation and the World Wide Web, it's become very much an international pursuit. And on the lower line, you can sort of see these other actions, I would say, that have, I would say, also influenced how we look at architecture. Obviously, the United Nations Declaration of Rights after World War II, but then you've also got, I would call them socioeconomic points of interest. So education for all, UNESCO saying all children should actually have free education by 1970. That didn't happen. United Nations Habitat started in the 1970s. The Brundtland Report is probably our first major intervention into sustainability. We've had the Millennium Development Goals, and now we're on the Sustainable Development Goals. So all these have an influence on how I would say architecture and the architecture and planning professions are perceived. If we add to this the effect of other things, in the UK particularly, we've got the end of the empire, the beginning of the Commonwealth, the demise of the Commonwealth. And this very much influences, I would say, the direction of which architectural education originally in the UK was, I think, focused, which is very much around saying, well, the mother country, come to the mother country. Certainly the history of architectural education in West Africa suggests that although countries like, well, aside from South Africa that had a, I would say, developed architecture system prior to 1945, certainly West Africa and later on East and the rest of Southern Africa, the idea was very much that the RIBA and education in architectural education was very much modeled on what was happening in the UK. And indeed, to begin with, you might start your architectural education, say in Kumasi, but you'd come out to do your part 2 and part 3 in the AA or wherever it is. So that was very, so it was a very much a Commonwealth focused, I would say, education system that was being taught, in the sense that the architecture would be, a lot of the syllabus was being developed here, and it was very much those from the former colonies, now the Commonwealth, and okay, an international outlook towards Europe and America. But there was a large amount of people, I would say, from the South who were part of this system. With the demise of the Commonwealth and the rise of the EU, I would say the focus begins to change, and also, as I said, with the bringing down of the Iron Curtain, and also the rise of Asia, architecture and indeed the way in which education takes place becomes, I would say, it becomes much more global in its thoughts. So just to overlay again, hope you're still with me, I could sort of say there are almost 3 periods. There's this kind of, I would say, 1945 to 1960s, where if you look at the bottom corner in red, the UK curriculum would have what I would call tropical school variants. And it's good I'm talking to the DPU, formerly, or at least it had an earlier history, as most of you will know, as the AA School of Tropical Architecture. So then by the time we get to the 60s to the noughties, so to speak, we're looking at a much more of a UK curriculum, but you had these niche project options. So when we had the kind of, if you like, the kind of post-colonial first iteration, it was a UK curriculum, but you could go to the AA School of Tropical Architecture, or indeed there was a very strong development of, the Kumasi School being, if you like, the tropical school for the AA, for example. By the time we get to the 60s and through to the noughties, the curriculum changes a bit. I think this is partly because indeed the institutes of architecture in places like Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya have their own curricula. So that changes a bit. So the UK curriculum becomes much more, I would say, based and focused on the UK and Europe, indeed, as it associates more with Europe. But you can, if you're embedded in the anthropology and areas of research, start to look at architecture within the lens of it being out with the European standard syllabus. I should also say, which I should have mentioned, we've got people like JFC Turner talking about whether architecture is really what one needs. We had Architecture Without Architects by Rudowski, but JFC Turner and co say, well, look, we're in the emerging world. Are we really going to be looking at the same kind of housing estates we're talking about in the West? Or should we be looking at more things around self-help and so on? So that discourse begins to influence how architecture training takes place. And if you're, I mean, I sometimes call it the Great Schism, but I think I'm being overreactive. But there is that slight change between, are you doing architecture for, if you like, what was then the developing world, that was what it was called, or are you looking at, I guess, a Western architecture syllabus? And then now we are where we are now in the 20s, I would say, from the mid-20s onwards, really, because the Black Lives Matter, decolonization, this has been going on for a while, but certainly in the recent past, it has become much more of a push in terms of what we're actually being taught in architecture. So again, very loosely, we could sort of talk about the international style, which is the high, I would say the high end of the United Nations and the idea about the global world. Then we've got this participatory community architecture. This is the JFC Turner group, and indeed Comteshka and other people in the UK who are looking at community architecture. I'd sort of say we've just about emerged from critical regionalism. So obviously name check people like Frampton and so on. But then we've got this kind of international star architecture development, so bear with me. But then also, I think there's a whole collaborative discussion that's going on as well, which again is becoming much more international, which again, talking about the students we have, maybe is not surprising. So, you know, from this kind of very participatory phase to begin with, we're now into what I would call much more of a collaborative stance. And this is being pushed both by the history and also the kind of students and indeed, I would say, world situations. And just the most complicated of the lot. In some ways, I'm sort of saying there's this move or cycle where things change, but then they become their stasis, and then we have change again. So I think that the thoughts or the ways in which the structures have changed have very much to do, I guess, with the emergent activities going on at the time. So I guess from what had been a very rigid set of curricula and so on, we've gone to what then became much more, I guess much more international and global, to something which we're not quite sure where it's going, but that these forms of thoughts change. So what am I actually saying? Well, I'd sort of say that, you know, the design studio has transformed. So we're now where we are now. So that's the historical context. So we could ask, you know, what's being taught? Who is it being taught to? And how is it being taught? So I'd sort of say, you know, the design studio has changed over time from being this almost Beaux-Arts design studio, which has changed over time to something that at one point was very sociology, anthropology based, but now we're looking at computing, tech, and other things. And this is all beginning to influence how architecture is being seen, and in the sense that architecture has very much widened, I'd say, in terms of what you might get at the end of it. So you've got practices like Assemble, for example, or forensic architecture. Now, the question is, who is being taught? Now, I think this is the interesting thing, because interestingly, or maybe not surprisingly, I am working with my school to look at the whole issue about who, you know, what the architecture profession is in terms of the students who are coming in. I mean, I would say, again, the elite is widening, but it's a widening international elite. But they're asking for different things from what would have been asked back in the 1950s. So there's that issue about, you know, they're much more globally traveled. They are asking, and asking quite rightly, you know, in terms of what the syllabus might be. And then how is it being taught? So this, I guess, links to the what and the how. So I'd sort of say, as I've sort of said, in kind of in inverted commas, the tour is going global. So we're now looking at these, you know, development design studios, which have, you know, over the last 5 to 10 years have become the thing. And again, that's the word about post-pandemic. These Zoom sessions again show that, you know, at a certain window of opportunity, probably between 2 o'clock and 4 o'clock, you can teach the world, because half of us are just waking up, the other half of us are just about to go to bed. So we've got this situation where the way in which architecture is taught is going to change. Partly again because of the what would I call it, the environment in which we are, where, you know, the world is slowly, maybe not as rapidly as we want, being connected, and that includes large parts of Africa and Asia. I was just reading in the Financial Times, the, what's it called again? It's the Equiano network, which is going to take the cabling for high-speed internet right around Africa. At the moment, there's one direct link between, I think it's New York and Accra in Ghana. So oftentimes when I'm in Ghana, I have better internet links than I have in Edinburgh. That's the state of affairs. So what does this mean? So I think, you know, the now is all, where we are now is that this means that I guess in my life, we can now do things like exhibitions. There's a lot of research going on, which, you know, brings the West or the South to the West. This was an exhibition back about 8 years ago about Alan Vaughan Richards, a Nigerian architect. We have any number of conferences, and these are all pre-2020, which again gives us that link to Africa. And there are collaborations, which I think are, you know, they are definitely going, they are the thing probably of the future, which we'll talk about more. But I would say these collaborations so far have been very much the North handing its, or sending its hand out to the South to have these links. Although interestingly, the Accra Futurism, we've got our RIBA Prize winner, that's Lukasz there. So he's based in the UK. He's, I think his passport is Polish, amongst others. We've got Victoria, who is Nigerian, but born and brought up in America. And then we've got my good friend, his name emits me now, she's probably on the line, but she's from the University of Ghana. So we've already got how many continents in Accra at an exhibition. So this is already, again, I would say showing this international context. And indeed, Manchester School of Architecture is looking at making links with, this was going to be Kumasi. I know we're also talking about links with Lagos at the moment as well. And indeed, we have the traditional projects, which I sort of sometimes rail against. So, I mean, interestingly, this shows you how old I am. The person who designed this was one of my students back in Liverpool 15, 20 years ago. He's working with the Ministry of Education in Ghana. This is an earthquake-proof school, which he designed with the help of Arab. And those are the kids actually going through. And these are students of mine from Edinburgh who worked on a prototype, what was it called? It was a container school where we kind of deconstructed the container and created this learning hub. So these ideas about projects are also beginning to, are still continuing. I would say the aid model though is beginning to change much more. So these are, I would say, young people who are much more engaged than would have been in the past, say about 20 years ago, where it would very much be, well, we've got a project in Africa. These are the climatic characteristics, build it. So if we deconstruct the now, what am I trying to say? I would say that, you know, there are these structural theories around, okay, things have changed, but have they changed? In many ways, I think architecture remains quite an elite profession. So back to my early diagrams, although things have changed, those who are very much involved in architectural education, particularly those who come out to the West, for lack of a better word, are still elites in themselves, A, because of the cost, B, because of the way in which architecture is practiced. I think the development practice also is changing, but the networks are very similar. So here I am talking to the DPU. So we still have these, I guess, areas where these discussions take place, and they're areas in which international discussions around architecture particularly and institutions still, there's still very much of a concentration, whether it's the London school, some of the schools, indeed Manchester and so on, but there's still that network that continues. I think curriculum is changing. It's interesting because it's being, I think the demand is both from the students, but also I think in terms of where we are. So that's, if you like, the theories of change that, you know, it is environment to a large extent that has been pushing this change. And, you know, the question is, are we really decolonizing or are we reappropriating? So in some ways, I would say the curriculum was already decolonizing. What's happened is that at certain points with certain things happening, there's been that push to change or push the curriculum to change. But in some ways, the slight worry is that you have this almost circular situation where at certain points there's human rights, there's the Declaration of Rights. We talk about post-apartheid. There are various points where there's been a push to change things, but it's a continuing thing. And the worry one might have is that, you know, at certain points, does it just become virtue signaling? Are we just going through the motions, or is change actually happening? Is it transformational? And I think in some ways, as you might expect, so change is gradual anyway, because you know, in terms of whatever human development, you know, I was speaking to an architect who was talking about his memoirs. He was saying in the day, if he was doing a project in northern Nigeria, he would have to book the phone call a week ahead. And nowadays, obviously, with mobile telephony and so on, things have been much faster. But change is happening anyway. But at the end of the day, some of it is still the political economy of change. So there's no way in which I would say education, like everything else, and indeed architectural education, would have been stuck in the past, because just the sheer political economy of change means that that move from the Commonwealth to Europe to post-Brexit, now in the case of the United Kingdom, means that some of the expediency as to how we teach and where we're teaching is already changing, particularly because it's going to affect funding and research. I think what is interesting is that this idea about squaring the circle or circling the square is that if one takes education as that solid line, which it probably isn't, we're already breaking through it, partly because the needs of the curriculum have changed, but I think more importantly, those who are being taught and the ways in which the curriculum affects the future architecture has changed so much. I mean, the idea about collaboration being one way only, I think has changed a lot. Again, I mean, so this is a sort of, I think, well, pre the famous C. I mean, apart nowadays, instead of, you know, trips to Africa being exotic, the students are interested in going. In this case, the institution is happy to fund them to go to these to work with their colleagues. So these are some Manchester colleagues with Kumasi students producing an exhibition. Or in the case of my good friend, Professor Ian Jackson, he's working with people at Accra to produce an exhibition, which then gets looked at by kids in Accra, and indeed becomes a discussion point for the community in Jamestown. So the idea about, you know, us going there to do stuff has changed a lot, I think, already, towards being what is much more a collaborative practice, which again, you could throw back at me and say, well, that's what anthropology and sociology have always done. But I would say that what's interesting is that this is becoming more of the norm than it would have been, say, even 5-10 years ago. So we can see that change already happening. And yeah, I think just to summarize, I could see that being much more the case. And it's being omnidirectional in the way in which these things take place. So last slide, which again is shamelessly promoting some of the things I do. This is a writing workshop. And again, this is to do with the social politics of funding. Now, in theory, the way in which that funding bid was written by a funding institution which will remain nameless was very much about, I would have to frame it that I would go in and I would then teach people how to write papers with me, and then they would be published in a 4-star journal. What I actually did do was, I guess, slightly subvert it. I mean, the argument was that no, first of all, it's very important to start with the younger students. So these are all architecture students with some from elsewhere who need to start understanding the need to write their own histories. So instead of it being this kind of intensive writing workshop, it became very much a peer-to-peer discussion where we had young Ghanaians working with themselves, doing peer mentoring of their work and developing what became a blog on architecture in Accra. And again, to show you the international dimension, which never goes away, the fairer colored student in the middle is actually from America, and she was doing time out in Ghana. She joined the workshop. There's somebody else who's a filmmaker. There's somebody else who had a scholarship who was about to go off to Switzerland to do his PhD. I mean, so even within the country, it becomes a mixture of students. I think the byline there is that, you know, you'd have to have the access to social media because it was advertised on social media to be able to be at that event. But the idea being that, you know, Africa can write back. It's not always a case of sort of it coming from there. A lot of this was very much locally generated. And I think that's likely to be the future, that we can actually do this omnidirectional transnational travel, hoping that the big C goes away, because we are all much more able to do that. And because they are probably going to be the educational elite of the future, but they are, if you like, on both sides of the Atlantic, since we're talking from the island of the United Kingdom. But I think this, I would say, bodes well. We simply have to look at how we explore that and how we think about, I guess, us being in a much more global world, and architecture, like other forms of other disciplinary sciences, having a much more, I think, omnidirectional link to both, well, the past and the present in terms of history, but I think in terms of how we understand ourselves and how we live our lives, it being much more transnational than it would have been 20 years ago. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Ola, and thank you, you know, for doing it, you know, within the right time framework. Now we will move to Dr. Kamna Patel, our colleague from the DPU. Kamna is an anthropologist, so I think it will be an interesting view on what has been said so far. And again, feel free to pose your questions.
Thank you very much, Haim, and thank you very much, Ola. I should say I'm not an anthropologist, but I feel so flattered that you think I might be. Honestly, I wear it as a badge of honor, so thank you, Haim. Ola, thank you. I think that your presentation has so much provocation within it. And one of the things that I'm intrigued by is, in the written description of the blurb as well, are your characterizations of development studies. So as well as not being an anthropologist, I'm not an architect and I don't teach undergraduates. And so when I was reading that blurb and as I was listening to your presentation, I'm very much speaking from my own training here, which is in academic training and also in practice as somebody very much grounded in and engaged with critical development studies and development work. And so it's through this training that I have that I also engage with the project of transformative education, specifically within the Bartlett, which would be the faculty home for us, with my other hat on, my other faculty role hat on. There are 3 points that I want to pick up on that speak a little bit to one of the slides when you were asking who is being taught, what is being taught, and how is this being taught? And I want to sort of say a little bit about those three. On that question of who is being taught, it became quite clear to me that there are some really interesting parallels that are going on with your reflections of architecture and also with general reflections, I'd say, of the state of higher education in the UK. And the one that stands out are the circulations of class and its intersections with race in the classroom as embodied by students. And these would be students, whether they're in Edinburgh, whether they're in Manchester, whether they're at UCL in London. These are elite spaces in which these circulations of class occur. And what I'm intrigued by is the effect that this has on epistemic plurality in particular. When we're talking about transformative education, I think that's what we want more of. We want people to imagine and see the world from multiple positions, from multiple lived experiences. And where that is restricted, and I think these circulations of class and wealth, even though they intersect with race, are in effect a restriction and curtailment of imagination and thought on what is possible. The most useful analytic that I find in dissecting that further is one of racial capitalism in UK higher education specifically. And here I'm talking about the differential values that are placed on racialized bodies in the neoliberal university. So in our case, that might be so-called Southern international students who pay more for their fees, and something that's ever more marked with, I imagine, in now this post-Brexit landscape where the Southern becomes a little bit more pronounced, where they pay more fees, but our Black and brown students from the North are valued less at the same time. And we see this valuing captured in attainment gaps and awarding gaps and all of these other differentiations that occur within people's educational experiences in the UK. So that's my comment on who is being taught. Around what is being taught. And here I'm intrigued by the period that you're calling, I suppose, now, and these conversations that we're having around decoloniality and decolonization. And this need that might be in architecture, but I see it in development studies, is to turn somewhere else, to turn to something notionally called the South, or wherever, whatever that might be, to decolonize. And the debate for me when it comes to UK higher education is not decolonizing higher education in general. It's not decolonizing architecture in general or development studies in general, but decolonizing here. So UK higher education, development studies in London, in my case, architectural studies in Manchester, I presume in yours. And it's through this deeper engagement that we can get to specificity. And that's to decolonize particular emblems and structures and legacies of British colonialism and imperialism, including the perceived value and gold standard of a British degree in English. And that's coded in curricula. And the professional capital that then carries with it when one wants to practice architecture or be a development practitioner in some way. And I think that this particularity becomes really important because it turns our gaze inward. And it makes all of us that work in UK higher education responsible. It responsibilizes, it's not really a word, but it responsibilizes us to make permanent the baggage of racism and knowledge superiority so that we are always dealing with it. And we don't forget in 2 years' time because something's moved on. The world has moved on and those external dynamics have moved on. I think where we as educators fail to create the space and to harness the energy and to seize the agenda when it comes to undoing colonialism and its multiple facets, what we're revealing is a paucity of our own imagination. And I think what we're also revealing and what it reflects is, again, this idea of racial capitalism, the circulations of racial capitalism in the value afforded to racialized minority bodies in the academy and their disproportionate representation. And we see that in holding precarious contracts and in hitting promotion ceilings. The third point, if I may, is about how is what is being taught. And here I can see the most productive conversations that we could be having in these cross-disciplinary ways between architecture and development studies particularly. And I wrote down here, word for word, where you identified two sort of mechanisms, where the North is sending its handouts to the South as a way to define collaboration. To me, that's the history of development studies. And it may well be some of the present as well. Perhaps my colleagues will disagree with me, but that's the sort of position that I take. And then the second is this idea of projects as a mode of engagement. Now, projects have a very particular conceptualization in practices of development, and it's quite an old-fashioned one. And in the 1990s, there was a series of studies called, it was called Goodbye to Projects. And it was all about how we need to challenge this as a very particular and specific and modernist mode of engagement in the so-called global South, or then developing countries or third world, whatever the nomenclature you prefer. And so I see that this dialogue is very much a dialogue, and very much a cross-disciplinary dialogue and an interdisciplinary dialogue, because if this is the future of architectural studies and engagements with Southernism and the South and all the things that that could mean, then gosh, what does that mean when some of these ideas have been critiqued so strongly within development scholarship? So I think there's really amazing productive ground in thinking through collaborations that are not just north-south in quite limited terms, and thinking through modes of engagement that go beyond a project and divert from a project. I will stop because I think there are lots of questions. I think there are questions popping up all the time, but I do want to say I really, really like the pictures of Kumasi, and I should confess here that I did my master's in Manchester and went on those exotic field trips to Ghana with IDPM at the time.
There you are.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kamna. I think we can, the conversation has started. So Ola, one option is that, we'll respond to Kamna shortly and then we'll move to the questions. Okay? Or do you want us?
I mean,
what do you say?
I'm in agreement with her analysis. I mean, I think that that word epistemic polarity is really where it's at in terms of how we look at how these things take place. And certainly the idea about the gold standard is something that remains very much in place. But I think my view is that it is beginning to shift slightly, just because, again, the economic power and everything means that some of the things we took as a given, even 20 years ago, have changed. But there's certainly something around the elites that are still self-selecting elites, wherever they're from, which is worrying in terms of how we see development, both from here and from there. But the thing about the there is that it's becoming much more international. So the idea that we can just sit in London and be able to, I guess, rule the roost is going to change. Now, how that will change will be interesting. But I think the worry that I'm signaling is that it might still be the elites, but it's just a different set of elites elsewhere. And the fact that we have much better technology and everything doesn't make that change, doesn't mean that the change is going to be equal in any way. I think that would be the point I would make of it. But I was just looking, I think the value and attainment gaps, I think that is something that will start to get changed, will start to change. Certainly, I think with a middle class that is growing elsewhere, but it's what that middle class does, because the worry is that even if you switch it around, we replicate the same thing, which is in some ways the history of decolonization, indeed, independence movements in Asia and Africa in the 1960s. Things didn't necessarily change for the best.
Okay, thank you very much, Ola. Can you see the Q&A box, or do you want?
Yeah, okay.
So we have several questions. Maybe we could start with Elżbieta Kaleta.
Okay.
Her question she's asking, could you elaborate on what is restraining the change in the academia from taking place quickly enough to respond to the urgent needs of climate change and global inequality. And then we have Oren and Anonymous and Edward Dennison and Ian Jackson at the end.
Okay.
So
right.
feel free to play
Let's
with it.
take the climate change thing first. I think that's a very interesting one, because I think in some ways we are responding to it. If anything, I would say that what we found in architecture is that compared to the Black Lives Matter situation, there's been much more on climate change. And I think the issue is how we relate that to, if you like, what the subjects in the South are experiencing. So again, it's very easy to talk about climate change from here, but if we really understand the issues, it is very much a development paradox. For a lot of the South, the issue is, it is as is being politicized. If we're going to look at climate change and stopping emissions, how then does development take place in what is still very much an energy intensive landscape in which we live? And this is back to the idea about collaborating and developing ways in which we can look at improving the lives of everybody. Because in some ways, the climate change discourse, particularly in the West, is often about, what would I say, high energy use, and also the need to use less energy intensive materials. But the reality is a lot of the ideas around sustainable materials, again, is back to what we were looking at in the 60s and so on. But again, the circle goes round, and it's much more difficult sometimes to get sustainable materials in the South, even though the materials are in the South, than the standardized materials like concrete and so on that we're now trying to, if you like, stop using in the North. So unless we have much more of a relationship between what we're doing indeed in the building industry and in the design industry, this is always going to be a problem. So, and also it's that need about who's going to be doing the change. So there's almost that inference that that's a problem for the South. We're already on top of it, whereas it's a problem for the world. So this is the idea about having a much more global relationship to how we look at, I guess, particularly the building industry in this case, but architecture being one of the key, or architects being one of the key players in this. So yeah, I mean, I think it is being looked at, and that's what some of these international global organizations do. But do remember that in, I think, COP before this, the USA refused to sign any of the documentation. A lot of the small island states were the most vociferous, but because they have very little economic power, very little has been done to help their livelihoods. And a lot of this climate change is actually affecting the South more than the North in terms of low-lying, the effects of, well, whether the desert is taking back the land or indeed the seas for coastal climates. But yeah, I mean, I think I'd leave it there, and let's go on to Oren's question, which is, I'm taking a look. In your eyes, is there such a move in architecture? So that's the move about looking north and east. This move is changing teaching and theorizing and highlighting the experiences and knowledge gathered in post-colonial. Okay. I think it is. It is getting very, Oren, it is happening. It's slower than it might be. But part of the things I'm involved in, particularly in West Africa, is getting us to look at our experiences. Because again, some of that is the post-colonial landscape. Remember that a lot of Africa was literally divided in Berlin a long time ago. And in West Africa, particularly, we have this checkerboard, English, French, and we don't necessarily speak to each other. So part of what's happening with a lot of these, I would say, regional alliances is that these lived experiences are beginning to take fruit. Also, actually, Southern Africa is driving a lot of discussions around African networks. So we are now beginning to have South-South networks, but it is taking longer because, again, well, a lot of the countries in Sub-Saharan Africa are not rich. That's the reality. So to actually fund some of these activities is a challenge. but it is happening. And I think this is part of technology and the ability to actually travel more successfully. If I were to, again, do my anecdotal, it was cheaper for me to fly from, I think it was London to Johannesburg than London to Lagos. And to get to Lagos, to get to Johannesburg from Lagos, you had to go back to Europe and change plane. That's how bad it was. As at, it must have been about 15 years ago, there were at least 10 flights from Lagos to Johannesburg on a daily basis. So that's how much things changed in whatever it is, 20 to 30 years. So even the inter-African links anyway, physically were limited, but there's been much more intellectually that's happening now. And I think there's a maths initiative where I think it's Nigerian students have a link to Southern African universities. So that again excludes the North altogether. That's at master's, I think it was up to master's level. But so these things are beginning to happen, but it's taking a while. But yes. Anonymous attendee. We have some new, what are some new emerging themes? Okay. Well, I mean, I would say that we can do things real time, which we didn't used to do. So, I mean, again, back to even my experience in the old days, but certainly before high-speed computing, which is what this Equiano project will do. It literally means that I could be drawing here and I could be working in parallel with somebody in Kumasi. So that will change things in terms of how we think about things in, well, three-dimensionally in the case of architecture. But also, I think pragmatically, as I said, the omnidirectionality, it means that, I mean, I did actually choose the picture of the hotel. I mean, that was one of the most interesting hotel experiences I've had. And it was in Africa, and I wasn't on safari. So some of these facilities for the elite means that the elite can actually move across and they could be anywhere. I mean, actually, again, anecdotally, apparently the modeling industry goes to Cape Town because they follow the sun. But the reality is for a lot of people, that ability to move post the big C is going to be possible. But again, our ability to use Zoom or whatever its future will be, and I always say the boys and girls in San Francisco are probably busy creating what's going to be our next avatar situation, means that we can do quite a lot more than we would have done 5 years ago. I mean, the joke, of course, is that for a lot of, again, Western education, as including the UK, is that we probably had all these tools in our box, but we never had to use it. But this has made us actually come to the fore and start having these discussions. Mini anecdote. I mean, the first time I heard about Zoom was in Lagos. It was back in, what is it, October. So when this thing was a twinkling in the eye. So some of these technologies are available. And again, this is the truth of human experience. I mean, whatever the ideas about, as we were saying, knowledge attainment, the reality is we know that the youth, wherever they are now, are actually very, very able to deal with these technologies, which will probably transform how we do things in the future. And certainly for architecture and anything that's three-dimensional, the ability to do these things on the screen has already made a difference and surely is going to make more of a difference. Edward says, one directional nature, practically, how can we level the playing fields and achieve the omnidirectional system? Well, we'll see. I think, I mean, actually, I mean, this is me going back into history. Already, I know that the missionary system in Scotland means that there are Presbyterian Presbyterian pastors from West Africa who have parishes in deprived areas of Scotland now already. I don't think a lot is said about it, but the reality is that I think as we get to more collaborative learning, because I think the reality which Kama says is true, there is an imbalance at the moment in terms of how teaching systems work. But the more we see of each other's teaching systems, which is what these kind of platforms allow us, the more we're able to have a large number of educated young people, wherever they're from, who can actually operate in different situations. People give the example of footballers. The story in football was that, oh, well, black footballers could never deal with the cold in the UK. Tell me a Premiership football team that doesn't have a black footballer. I mean, you know, the Americans have black skiers in their skiing teams, for goodness sake. But I think on a more realistic note, I think that will be the case. And in fact, let's bring in the big C now. In West Africa, the reality seems to have been that because we've had a high level of science input, with obviously with funding from the West and so on, and because we'd had issues like Ebola in the past, West Africa was much more prepared to deal with some of the initial outbreaks to do with the big C at the moment. And in fact, I listen to Focus on Africa on a regular basis. Now I can get it on BBC Sounds. And the most clear example of contact tracing and tracking that I've ever heard was given in an interview with a Senegalese epidemiologist. And I mean, the way he explained it and the way in which he said it had worked for Ebola was, you know, it was a textbook case. So, I mean, already some of the high science that, you know, I mean, let's face it, it's taken us a while to get to our world beating whatever it is we're at now, already exists. And this is a community of scientists who again, know no borders. So we know it's possible, but it's, I mean, some of it again is, as Kama was saying, how we perceive certain bits of professions, whether it's architecture and so on. I mean, that's why I did talk about the star architect, but I won't go into more detail. But it is interesting that the two, if you like, non-European star architects have been Zaha Hadid, who's from Iraq, and David Ajayi, who, well, okay, he's been British educated, but he is Ghanaian. I mean, I think that says everything that there is to be said, in the sense that we know that there are issues, particularly, I have to say, in architecture that we are still having to face and confront. But I think I'm certainly very much, what's the word, invested in the next generation, because I think because of their experience, they are still an elite group, but I think they have a different attitude again, which is part of the issues about how we're looking at voting in the future and so on. They have different issues. And I think most of their issues anyway is around much more equality. And I think issues around class and race actually are much more in the fore than they would have been when I was a young person, for example. So I think it might not be our generation, but the next generation. Ian, do you see the writing workshop and exhibition as a successful model? Could be. How can we rethink the problematic sense of knowledge dissemination from the north to the south? I think it is, because I mean, Ian, I mean, you could see you were name checked. I mean, I think I could have had the photograph of you working directly with what's his name in Jamestown. I mean, you worked on an equal basis. I mean, there's a guy who Ian worked with. I mean, okay, he'd had part of an education in the UK as a graphic designer, but he effectively worked really closely with Ian, and really it's entire, I think it was definitely a 50-50 effort to get that exhibition up. And what I liked, as I showed in the other image, was that these children came off from their pathway home to look at the history. Strong proverb in Africa: if you don't know your history, you won't know. If you don't know your past, you're not going to know your future. So this ability to engage at that level was something that I think Ian will admit himself he wouldn't have been able to do without working in direct collaboration with Alote, that's his name. And I mean, there have been a series of projects I have observed, again, as a slightly older person, that Alote has worked with. And this was a very, very successful project. So I do think that's possible. And I think the more, again, that we look at doing collaborative activities where it isn't, I mean, the problem, of course, is the asymmetric link to funding, which is a difficult one. But again, I think we need to look at the scientists. if the scientists are able to create, I think, a body of trusted international researchers, there's no reason why in the humanities we can't, unless there's something wrong with our model. So we have to challenge the structural models of inequality in the humanities, I would say. And it's not that there isn't the possibility to do it. And again, the other example I give as a boring Nigerian is the University of Ibadan. I mean, at its apex before the oil crash in Nigeria, Oxford and Cambridge graduates were really, you know, they were applying to go and do their PhD in Ibadan because it had the facilities, it was a center of learning and so on. I guess you could go back to Timbuktu if it comes to that. So it's very much, I think, having a belief and also, I guess, yeah, working on the educational systems that exist in parts of Africa and Asia that in some ways, yeah, I think in terms of development economics have been put aside as these cycles of activity happen. And I would say we're getting into this global cycle now, which we really need to work with. Because again, at the end of the day, it's for everybody's benefit. And I don't think the model we have now has been successful in doing that. David, thank you very much.
I think, Ola, if you could take the very last question now, so we will finish on time.
Okay. Are partnerships most initiated and sought more by Northern institutions? In what ways could their teaching and practice be disadvantaged without such engagements? Absolutely. I mean, I think the problem is that the model, again, if we go back to structures and indeed the issues that Kama brought up, I think the problem oftentimes with Northern institutions is that there's still that notion, I guess, about being the gold standard or whatever. And that affects how the North looks at the South. And I think until, I guess that is the structural change. We are one world and it's not just mealy mouth discussions. I've given examples of science and so on. So I think without that understanding of the South, because we're also international, it's not going to help. If you like, you have to see the curve and try to be at least on the side of being ahead of it and not behind the curve, which I think is part of some of the issues indeed that we might be feeling now. It's far from me to say in terms of having certain, well, indeed, in certain countries and so on. I mean, the idea would be very much to take an internationalist and global look. And I think my parting comments would be, particularly in the case of the United Kingdom, that has always had this, or has always had an international appeal. I think this would be the time again for us to look at whatever world-class and world-beating might be, but it has to be global, I think, in terms of how we collaborate and how we look at education. And architecture being one of those that actually does matter. And I think we would do well to show that internationalization in terms of how we go on to the 2020s and further afield. It's got to be international, it's got to be collaborative. And I think that's what our youth want. And it's got to be, I guess we need to check our privileges. It can't just be elitist either.
Yeah. Thank you very, very much, Ola. Unfortunately, we cannot continue. I see that Hannah Leroux had a very interesting comment and question that she will be happy to discuss with you further. But unfortunately, we have to finish now. I would like to thank Kamna for her comments and very much to Ola for participating. And I really hope that it's, you know, just the beginning of a conversation, which I find very interesting and important. So thank you very much. And I guess that we will see you in our next Dialogues in Development session. Thank you very much.